Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to Columbus, Ohio on March 5th, 1863, where a mob of about 100 people, allegedly soldiers and citizens dressed as soldiers, broke into and destroyed the contents of the offices of the Columbus Crisis, an anti war newspaper supporting the peace faction of the Democratic Party known as the Copperheads. The Brigadier General pictured here, James Cooper, stepped in to suppress the mob, restore order, and guarantee the right of a free press in the middle of a war that was increasingly turning ugly as anti war factions were getting tired of the war and calling for peace. Brigadier General Cooper was born in Maryland in 1810 and after college in Pennsylvania, settled in a sleepy little crossroads town you may have heard of called Gettysburg, where he became an attorney. That was in the 1830s. He rose to become a U.S. Senator, aligned with his fellow Senator Thaddeus Stevens. Cooper retired from the Senate and politics in 1855 and returned to law and his native Maryland, probably thinking that he would enjoy quiet in his later years. However, when war loomed, he came out of his retirement to fight to keep Maryland in the Union. And when the war came, President Abraham Lincoln authorized Cooper to recruit a brigade for the U.S. Army. He did it. And after campaigning in the West, and Western Virginia in particular, received orders to move over the border into Ohio and take command of Camp Chase, the military base and prisoner of war facility located near Columbus. Now, Cooper was the ranking officer when the attack on the Crisis newspaper occurred on March 5th. That newspaper, the Crisis, had began publishing in 1861. It borrowed its name from Revolutionary War era publications that had grown up against British rule. In fact, the Crisis cast Abraham Lincoln as a tyrant every bit as evil as King George III. 2 days after the offices of the Crisis were destroyed, the County Democratic Party, the Central Committee, met at the courthouse in Columbus. So many people showed up that the meeting had to be adjourned and moved outdoors. After a series of speeches in the typical 19th century style, the committee issued a set of resolutions to address the need to, quote, maintain law and order, to consider ways and means to preserve and protect the life, liberty, and property of our people, end quote. In this excerpt, which comes from one of the local newspapers, you'll hear mention of three newspapers: the Columbus Crisis that I mentioned earlier, and two other Democratic leaning local newspapers: the Ohio Statesman, which is where this excerpt is taken from, and the German language newspaper called Der Westbote. So, without further ado, here's the excerpt of the story, which mentions Cooper towards the end. So, here we go. On the night of the 5th instant, a mob of about 100 persons, composed of soldiers and citizens disguised as soldiers, armed with swords and revolvers, broke into the editor's rooms of the Crisis newspaper and destroyed whatever property they could lay their hands upon, and in various ways injured the building. They afterward repaired to and attacked the office of the Ohio Statesman, and only desisted upon the police and some citizens rallying to its defense. They also, as we are informed, threatened the destruction of the Westbote. They manifestly intended to suppress, by illegal violence, the entire Democratic press of the city. These acts were planned and executed with such secrecy and dispatch that the crisis rooms were sacked and the attack upon the statesman office begun before the existence of the mob was well known to any considerable number of our law abiding citizens, and thus the defense of the crisis rooms was prevented. That these deeds were instigated by persons who dared not take an open hand in their commission, we have good reason to believe, but until we shall have further and accurate information upon this point, we forbear to mention names, lest we should be wrong anyone who may be unjustly suspected. These outrages are the natural consequence of that fatal disregard of the Constitution and the laws that has marked the course of our administration, federal and state, ever since the war began, and of the false and flagrant assaults upon the patriotism, motives, and purposes of the Democratic Party, daily indulged in by the Republican press and Republican politicians. When the public authorities, sworn to support the Constitution, set the example of violating its most sacred provisions, when citizens guilty of no crimes against the law were illegally arrested, transported, and imprisoned, when the writ of habeas corpus was practically suppressed, when a censorship over speech and the press was assumed and frequently practiced, when the terrible doctrine, utterly destructive of freedom and free institutions, that the government in times like these may do whatever it deems necessary. However, in so doing, it may violate the Constitution, were boldly proclaimed, when the rights of property guaranteed by the Constitution were openly invaded and sought to be overthrown by an executive proclamation. When these and like examples of disregard of our laws and constitutions, of our rights and liberties, were set by the officers of government themselves, it is not singular that rash and unthinking men should be found ready to follow such examples. And when, in addition to all this, the Republican press and politicians, in violation of truth, decency, policy, and patriotism, and for the merest and basest partisan purposes, were daily charging one half, if not more, of the Northern people with treason or sympathy with treason, when even governors of states in public speeches cast such imputations upon a majority of their own constituents, when every artifice that malice could invent and industry imply was being resorted to in order to mislead and prejudice the army against the Democratic Party, when, for that purpose, Democratic newspapers were excluded from its lines and camps, while abolition newspapers were freely admitted, when secret, irresponsible, oath-bound, and armed societies were forming to suppress the voice of democracy and trample upon the public will, when all the machinery to produce a reign of terror was being prepared and set in motion, it is not wonderful that ignorance, passion, and prejudice should bid defiance to the laws. We note these things not to excite wrath, but to warn every man who desires to preserve the peace of society, the liberties and property of the people, the laws and constitution of the land, that it behooves him to set his face against all aggressions upon either. Constitutions and law make free. Respect for them preserves it. Disregard of them brings despotism or anarchy. The Democratic Party has ever been and yet is a law abiding party. It asks nothing but its rights under the Constitution and the laws. It resorts to no violation of either. It countenances no violation of either. It has a right to all the guarantees of public and private liberty and of property contained in our fundamental laws. And it will surrender not one of them. It has the right to discuss public measures and will discuss them. It has the right to propose and advocate the policy which deems best for the nation, and it will exercise that right. It has a right to have its policy passed upon the people by the people at peaceable and untrammeled elections, and it will maintain that right. If found in a minority, it yields obedience to all lawful rule of the majority. If it be the majority itself, it claims that its lawful will be respected. Whether in a majority or a minority, it obeys all laws that are in force. Those that it dislikes, it seeks to overthrow, not by violence, not by legitimate repeal. Those that it proposes, it seeks to carry not by force, but by legal enactment. And what it does in all these respects, it demands and has a right to demand, and all others shall do. They owe the same obedience to the Constitution and the laws that Democrats owe. They have the same interest to maintain free government, to protect liberty, to be secure in their houses, persons, and property that Democrats have. It is neither their interest nor ours that despotism or anarchy should prevail, and if they wish to avert both, let them see to it in time that they give no occasions for either. We will do our duty, let them remember to do theirs. In view of the circumstances that have brought us together, we hereby resolve 1. That the will of the people is the foundation of all free government, that to give effect of this will, free thought, free speech, and a free press are absolutely indispensable. Without free discussion, there is no certainty of sound judgment. Without sound judgment, there can be no wise government. 2. That it is inherent and constitutional right of the people to discuss all measures of their government and to approve or disapprove as their best judgment seems right. That they have a like right to propose and advocate that policy which in their judgment is best, and to argue and vote against whatever policy seems to them to violate the Constitution, to impair their liberties, or to be detrimental to their welfare. 3. That those and all other rights guaranteed to them by their constitutions are their rights in time of war as well as in time of peace, and of far more value and necessity in war than in peace. For in peace, liberty, security, and property are seldom endangered. In war, they are ever in peril. 4. We now say to all whom it may concern, not by way of threat, but calmly and firmly, that we will not surrender these rights, nor submit to their forcible violation. We will obey the laws themselves, and all others must obey them. 5. That the attempt recited in the preamble to suppress by force the democratic newspapers of this city was an outrage that demands an exemplary punishment of the guilty and condemnation of all men, and we call upon the civil and military authorities to ferret out the defenders in order that they may be proceeded against according to law. 6. Thanks are due and hereby tendered to Brigadier General James Cooper for the part taken by him in suppressing the mob and for his timely, manly, and noble general order published in this morning's papers of the city. 7. That our thanks are also due and tendered to Captain Albert B. Dodd, USA, and to the soldiers under his command for the part taken by them in preserving the peace on the night of the 5th instant and since. 8. That the city police deserve our thanks for their exertions and the occasion above referred to preserve the peace. 9. That the secretary transmit to General Cooper a copy of the above resolution number 6, to Captain Dodd a copy of resolution number 7, and to the police chief a copy of resolution number 8. After adoption of the foregoing preamble and resolutions, the meeting insisted upon having a speech from Judge Thurman. In compliance with the call, he came forward and spoke most eloquently and ably in vindication of the liberties of the American people. More speakers occurred, and finally, the meeting was adjourned with three cheers for the Union, the Constitution, the enforcement of the laws, and the observance of order. So there you have the story of the attack on the offices of the anti-war, pro-democratic party, anti-Lincoln administration newspaper, the party supporting that newspaper and other newspapers in Columbus, Ohio, and the role of General Cooper, who, in defense of free institutions, free speech, and the free press, stepped in to quell the riot and keep law and order. Little twist: Cooper did not survive the rest of the month. He soon fell ill with pneumonia and succumbed to the illness at the end of March 1863. His death was mourned in Pennsylvania and in his native Maryland. So take care, and thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.